Hello everyone, welcome to the ITRACKS webinar. Today we are hosting our Market Research Celebrity Series. This is an annual event that ITRACKS runs to showcase the talent within ITRACKS' network of market research professionals. My name is Garnett Weber. I am one of the founders of ITRACKS and I'm excited to host today's webinar. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Derby Swanson will be providing a presentation on integrated qualitative and quantitative research, a voice of the customer approach. This webinar includes a case study as well as a primer on best practice voice of the customer research methods. I'd like to introduce Derby now. Derby is a highly respected qualitative and quantitative market research practitioner with over 25 years of experience. Derby is a longtime customer and vendor of ITRACKS. We are often faced with research challenges for companies that require market research professional services in addition to ITRACKS technology, recruitment, and project management services. We have used Derby on several occasions for numerous projects, and she is a highly valued research partner, consistently providing value to clients. She is well known for her ability to integrate qualitative and quantitative approaches and her expertise in voice of the customer approaches. She earned her MBA from the Boston University in 1985 and began her career using quantitative research to model new product introductions for consumer packaged goods companies. In 1989, Derby joined the Applied Marketing Science, Inc., AMS, in a company co-founded by MIT professional John Hauser. During her tenure at AMS, Derby participated in development of foundational voice of the customer methodologies based on Dr. Hauser's research that helped pave the way for what is now considered best practice in new product development. Since 2011, Derby has been working as a market research consultant. I have personally had the opportunity to work with Derby on research projects and have grown to greatly appreciate her creativity, strong communication skills, and passion for research. It is our pleasure to host her in the ITRACKS Market Research Celebrity Webinar Series. Just in terms of how the webinar will take place, we are going to have a presentation by Derby, and if you have questions, I encourage you to enter them in the chat area at the bottom of the GoToWebinar panel. And if it makes sense, I will ask the questions during the course of the webinar, but I do expect that we'll have a fun question and answer session at the end of this or at the end of her presentation. So please feel free to answer questions as they come up. All right, go ahead, Derby.
Thank you so much, Garnett, and thank you for all of you out there who have logged in to hear this webinar. As Garnett has said, I'm going to be talking about integrating qualitative and quantitative research, but specific to that, this idea of the voice of the customer, which I'll be going into in some detail. Garnett already told you, I think, the basics about me as a researcher, and one of the things about having done this for so long, literally from the mid to late 80s, is that I remember a time before laptops, before the internet, before all of those things. And one of my favorite research memories is using a timeshare computer down at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee from Connecticut and having to force fit a handset from a phone into a quote-unquote portable computer that was the size and weight of a heavy suitcase. So I've been around for a long time, which has its pluses and minuses, I acknowledge. And as Garnett has said, for the past 25 years, I've been associated with this set of tools and techniques that's referred to as the voice of the customer, which is basically used for the most part to help companies develop products and services that are truly responding to customer wants and needs. And I'll be talking about that, as I said, in some detail. Now I am working on my own. I've worked in a variety of different industries over the years, so I have the advantage of a short learning curve when I'm presented with something new. And I find myself still very passionate about telling the story embedded in the research and being able to look at both the 10,000-foot view at the forest and also at the individual trees. I don't know if this is a problem for everybody, but I have found it a problem for many of my clients. Generally speaking, I think that there is a division in people's heads between qualitative and quantitative research. There are different skills involved if you're doing a focus group or one-on-one interviews versus doing heavy-duty data analysis. There are clearly different methods involved. And many times there are also different practitioners of qualitative and quantitative research. So clients will often choose one or the other. They'll either do qual or they'll do quant. But I think that there are some real challenges associated with a one or the other approach. The first is if you're just doing qualitative research, you've got small numbers. How do you project from that, and how do you make a statement about the wider world or the wider market for customers? And how do you escape the power of the anecdote? I find this to be a real challenge in final presentations with heads of departments or CEOs who have a story in their head and have used that to justify decision making, calling it the voice of the customer when it's really just the voice of one customer or their nephew or their mother-in-law. The flip side of that is if all you do is quantitative research, it's hard to tell, sometimes hard anyway, to tell a compelling story when you've just got numbers. There's no face to it. There's no story to it. And finally, if you haven't done basic qualitative and really understand the customers that you are trying to forecast for, how do you trust what you're actually measuring if you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on big, huge 1,000-person projects? How do you even know that you're asking the right questions? A solution to this is, I believe, a hybrid approach that combines qualitative and quantitative methods and, in fact, uses the best of both. With qualitative research, you have a small sample, so you can go very in-depth with individual customers or groups of customers. You have a chance as a researcher to have conversation with them, to hear the way they talk, and most importantly, to hear their stories. Combining that with quantitative research, you then go to the large sample. You can streamline your questioning by using a survey or other tools and techniques, and then you have the numbers. You have the percentages, you have the statistics, and therefore you have the confidence to be able to say categorically, as it were, this is the answer or this is the direction that we should be going. There are lots of different ways of combining qualitative and quantitative data, but the one that I've been involved with for a long time, for the 25 years, is this idea of the voice of the customer, which is actually grounded in very solid marketing science via Professor John Hauser at the MIT Sloan School, who actually published what I think is still one of the top requested case studies called The House of Quality from the Harvard Business Review. 25 years ago, John co-founded Applied Marketing Science to become the sort of output research engine to gather and use data, voice of the customer data. Full disclosure here is that I was actually one of the first employees of Applied Marketing Science 25 years ago, and I've either been working with them or for them for most of those 25 years. Voice of the customer has also proven to be a best practice in new product development via some surveys that have been done by the Product Development and Management Association. They've done a comparative performance assessment survey for a number of years, and one of the things that they have found really differentiates companies that do a measurably better job on new product development is actually using voice of the customer techniques and information. And as I said before, voice of the customer, and a lot of people call any kind of market research voice of the customer research, but there's some foundational things that I think are really important. The first is that VOC is rooted in the belief that customers' wants and needs, and I'll say more about what that means specifically, customers' wants and needs should be at the heart of any product or service development or improvement or changes. The other piece of that is that customers actually speak a different language than companies or divisions or engineers or even market researchers. And that language needs to be translated appropriately if you're really going to make the changes or put the things in place internally that will please those customers. Say a little bit more about that, customer language versus company language. Here we have some basic, you might call customer attributes. Customers want something that's easy to use, they want something that's convenient, and a specific example from automotive work is they want a roomy front seat. Well, customers want a roomy front seat, but if you're an engineer, you've got all of these different variables having to do with how you actually build that seat. Does roomy mean leg room? Does it mean headroom? Does it mean the width? Does it mean the cushion? And if you don't understand how roomy relates to those other things, you may not design something that a customer is going to think is roomy. Easy to use. This is a one that comes up in a lot of different scenarios, and the quote here is an actual one from an engineer that we worked with early on who was trying to design an interface. And customers want something that's easy to use. Well, their response is, well, there's 150 buttons. There's a button for everything. You can make your own decision as to whether that's easy to use. I would say that it's likely not. Convenient is another one. If you're talking about a convenient place to do business, is that based, are customers thinking about location? Are they thinking about hours? Are they thinking about parking being available? Again, if you don't understand the relationship between those things, you're not going to be really listening to the voice of the customer. And this last one, which is one of my favorites, is from work that we did, this is a long time ago, for the airline industry. And as the presentation was being given, this voice of the customer presentation was being given, one of the clients, was making notes and wrote down, orderly boarding procedures as being really important to customers. Well, what the customers actually said was they didn't want to be herded like cattle. And if you've flown recently, I would say that they're still actually not listening to the voice of the customer on this one. So these kinds of things can really either help or get in the way as you're doing product and service development. Now, voice of the customer has a qualitative and a quantitative component. First, you need to make sure that you're actually talking to the right customers. You want to be talking to the people who are users of the service or product, potential users of the service or product, and make sure that you're actually thoroughly understanding their wants and needs. And I'm not going to go into huge detail about this, but there really is a difference between wanting and needing, wants and needs, and things like solutions. A solution to a need for ease of use might be having a button for everything, but that might not be the best solution. So you want to understand what's behind it. Target values. Back in the day, we talked a lot about dots per inch in terms of having fine resolution or good resolution on something that was printed. Well, dots per inch is an old technology, dot matrix printing, that doesn't even exist anymore. So getting stuck too soon on solutions and target values can really limit your ability to think out of the box and be innovative. Wants and needs are also not opinions about things, liking something or not liking something. And it's not about counting at this stage, it's just about listening to hear what the stories are and making sure that you've covered a breadth of information and really engaged with the whole experience that the customer goes through when they interact with a product or service. Then, once you have that, then you can survey a larger group of customers via quantitative data and then prioritize those wants and needs. Think about how they're organized in the customer's mind. Then you can evaluate possible solutions and test concepts and so forth. So basically, first you get the why, and then you get the what. There are also some best practices in VOC. As I said, a lot of people use the terminology when they're talking about any kind of market research. But, and again, this is back to my applied marketing science days, there are some best practices. Doing one-on-one interviews versus focus groups, for example. If you can do 30 to 35 face-to-face interviews with people at different locations around the country, you can really get at understanding in depth those individual respondents' stories. And then you can actually do an extensive text analysis that lets you extract customer wants and needs from the transcripts of those interviews, and then go back to customers and ask them to actually organize them themselves. What goes in the bucket that's easy to use, what goes in the bucket that's about convenience. When companies do that on their own, many times they organize the wants and needs based on their company's internal structure and not on what customers want and need. After that, quantitative analysis, you can measure importance performance of customer attributes, find things that may be delighters that aren't necessarily important now but might be if they were able to be promoted. And you can also look at gaps between performance between yourself and current competitors. The challenge of all of this is it can be expensive. You're talking about travel and large numbers of interviews. You're talking about technology and effort to do these text analysis as well as the larger scale market research behind to get at some of the quantitative. So my question for myself and for all of you, I hope, is can these philosophies, the philosophies that are inherent in this approach, be used on a somewhat smaller scale and maybe with some different tools? And I'll be talking about that in a minute. So with that in mind, I want to talk about a case study. This is a project that I'm actually working on right now with a client. And I can't say too much about it because it's a real live ongoing project, but it's for a provider of family services. And so in terms of background and objectives on this study, it's a company in the service industry, and what they're trying to do is understand families with young children. They're doing well in the marketplace right now, but they're interested in developing or finding out if they need to develop a differentiated position that will enable them to stand out from their competition. And they also wanted to evaluate a long list of potential service offerings which they could give and find out which are the most appealing to current and also to potential customers. So I recommended to them this approach based on a qualitative, quantitative VOC model. So to first, the customer wants and needs, specifically around pain points, things that go wrong or don't go so well, issues that they're having with current services, sort of what's working well and what's not working so well currently. And then in the second phase of research, actually putting together the concepts and service offerings based on those needs and evaluating them more formally. In order to do this work, because as Garnett said, I've been working with and for ITRACKS for a couple of years pretty steadily, and I decided that it would make a lot of sense to use them because they're them and I like working with them, but also to have a single partner to use for both phases of the research. There are a lot of economies in terms of learning around that. And so for the qualitative work, used a tool called ITRACKS Board, also sometimes called BBFG, which stands for Bulletin Board Focus Group. So not individual interviews, cost prohibitive, and not a focus group, a real live focus group, or a real-time focus group. The ITRACKS board is a software platform which actually lets people, rather than in real time, sort of over 2 hours, lets them discuss a topic over time in what's called an asynchronous threaded discussion, which basically means a bulletin board where people can answer questions that you as moderator post, but that they can also talk to each other. But it takes place over time, so there's a chance to introduce new questions, there's a chance to probe with people, and there's a chance for things to kind of seek in and go on at a much deeper level than you can get when you're just talking to people over 2 hours. In this particular case, I have to say it worked really, really well. The text that we got as people were typing in answers was very rich and very detailed. In large part, I think, because the respondents, parents of kids and people in families, were really invested in the subject matter. This was something that they really cared about, that involved their lives and things that were important to them. The fact that we did this over multiple days, it was 3 days altogether, really let some soak time happen for them. We asked questions in such a way that there was a sequence to them. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you could tell that they'd also kind of been thinking about the topic as they were going forward and referred back to things that they had said originally. And they had a chance to go back and forth with each other, and I, as the moderator, had a chance to go in and ask them to either go deeper or expand on something. It really worked well. And although we were doing this project in fairly limited geography, there's no facility cost, there's no travel. I was actually surprised at how well this worked. And because it's all typed, at the end, you actually have your transcript right there. There's no need to go back to a recording and have it transcribed. So it worked really well. This is just a little bit more about the ITRACKS board. I guess it's shameless marketing, but it's all true and it works really well. There are other things that you can do through this that I didn't necessarily do, but there's the ability to use a whiteboard area where people can mark things up. There's a way for client observers to log in and actually talk to the moderator independent excuse me, of the group that's going back and forth. And there are also capabilities both through mobile devices and through video tagging and highlight reels, which can be very effective if you are looking to actually bring the voice of the customer sort of face-to-face with a client. So in any qualitative research, really important in voice of the customer research is who to talk to. Who are the right people to interview? Where are they, especially if you are doing things face-to-face? And how many of them do you need to talk to? In this case, it was parents with young children, and we were looking for an upper income sample. We, as I said, were working with a limited geography, which made it a real challenge for recruiting, but made it also really helpful for doing the asynchronous pieces of the research. We did 3 groups. We actually did 2 administratively, but we had a subset of one group that was actually for men to talk to dads, because we wanted to see if there was any difference qualitatively between moms and dads in terms of their wants and needs. And actually there weren't. So we were able to sort of absorb all of that when we started the quantitative. Once you have the people, you need to figure out what to ask them. A key of voice of the customer research is to carefully structure the interview or the, in this case, the group, so that you're really getting people to talk about their lives. And in this case, over 3 days, tell a story about things that really impact them. And there's a way to do that. You don't want to sort of bop all around and ask a series of unconnected questions. It's really important to have a flow and have a way for them to get into the topic that feels comfortable and actually feels natural. So starting with family life, leisure activities, things that people do, families do together, their schedule and so forth is how we started. Again, talking about themselves, talking about things that they already know about. Then we talked about decision-making on activities and various services to try to get at, directly and indirectly, the things that were important to them. And then the selection process. You know, how was the experience of both finding and also living with, as it were, the service providers that they were currently using? What was going well? What didn't go so well? And then finally, and this is literally the last day, thinking about the future. Not asking them, first off, to design the product or the service themselves, but to think about, you know, if you could wave a magic wand, what would it be like? What would happen? And then what we were able to do was put in front of them some new offerings and some concept statements that we had, but also were able to develop over the course, the first 2 days of the groups. How to ask it. With this kind of bulletin board, you can't, excuse me, you have a group of questions that you ask each day. You don't just sort of throw it all out there. So it's important to parse the discussion so that it's in manageable chunks, usually about 10 questions on a particular day. And so what I did, or what we did, was rather than just say, you know, the first 10 questions, the second 10 questions, the third 10 questions, is to put questions in groups that had themes to them so that people could see in advance what the basic questions were going to be and had a chance to, again, think of things in terms of chunks or in terms of stories. I have a couple of examples of actual questions from this work. This is all one question. You know, think back to when you were actually looking to make arrangements. We could, you know, and we could have just said, you know, what are you looking for? What was important to you? But by having the sub-bullets about must-have attributes and what were they, you know, was there anything that was a deal breaker? If so, what was it? People were actually able to respond in fairly long paragraphs that answered these questions, but again, let them tell the story about what had happened and what was important to them. Similarly, about the actual process, you know, how was it? What went well? What didn't go so well? Another key of voice of the customer interviewing is really getting at the why. You know, why was that easy? Why did that work? What was convenient about that? And so the probing that the moderator that I was able to do helped get even more detail around those wants and needs. In terms of how to ask it, another factor that I found very useful in working with my client was we kept the last day a little loose. We had some basic questions, but what we decided was that we were getting enough information that we were really able to focus in on that last day get them this list of service offerings, which they were able to organize and pick top and bottom choices through the whiteboard activity that was part of the ITRACKS board. And we were also able to take some existing concepts and do some refinement on them before we sort of flash them in front of people as just a preliminary check. I do want to say that the ITRACKS platform has lots and lots of capabilities, as I said before, that we explicitly chose not to use for this project. The fear was that they would actually end up being distracting, both for the respondents, but for myself as well. This was my sort of first in-depth experience with this particular platform, and I didn't want to get hung up on trying to do everything at once. We were really focused on getting the text and getting the stories, and we were using that information to go directly into the next phase of research. If the objectives had been a little bit different, I might have experimented with a lot more of those. And in fact, I definitely look forward to using those on a next project because there's really some cool stuff. And this is just some of the advanced features. You know, you can do video responses. You can do video and imaging markup exercises within the board. You can do polling. You can do, as you can see, all kinds of things. So it can be a lot more, dare I say, sexy. But I think it's important to choose the features that you need that are appropriate to the individual project. So what do you get out of all this? What did we get? The first thing, as I said, is just this transcript. And this is just 2 examples from total, I think, 38 respondents we had all together, just talking about, you know, a typical day. You know, where do you go? What do you do? And these are actually shorter examples, honestly. Some of them would have filled up the whole screen or a couple of different screens. But you can see that there's a lot of moving parts in these stories. People are dropping off and picking up. There's 2 different people working. There's people in different facilities. They're doing different things on weekends. So that all sort of went into the hopper in terms of being able to give some insight and some information back to my client. The other thing in using those transcripts and using the ability to look at the data in some different ways, we weren't trying to do actual extraction of words and phrases from this data. It was really intended to be more of a top-line thematic discovery. But what I realized was that you can do it in a couple of different ways. You can do very in-depth stories on a respondent-by-respondent basis and organize it by individual, you know, Sally, Ann, Emily, Peter, and go, okay, Sally, what did she say on question 1, question 2, question 3? And then you get Sally's story and Ann's story and Emily's story. But you can also flip that around and go in-depth by topic, which is actually what I did more of in this particular case. And actually this took a lot of cutting and pasting, honestly, because I really did just flip the spreadsheet around. But now you can look and get a summary of, okay, what were all the responses to question 1? What were all the responses to question 2? And you can get very in-depth by topic as opposed to in-depth by respondent, and I found that very useful. So what does the client get, or what did the client get in this case? The first thing is there was an interim report, very thematic, quotes, pain points, stories, the ability to confirm some hypotheses, and also some interesting new ideas emerging out of this voice of the customer information that we were going to move forward and test. The other thing was that we did get a chance to get some initial reaction to both the concept statements and the new service offerings via the polling capability within the bulletin board. We were able to actually ask people, you know, which of these do you prefer? It's qualitative. As you can see, this is 9 out of 13 and 4 out of 13 people from one of the groups. But still a chance to put a hypothesis together and to find out why people were choosing one versus the other. So that ended up actually being very useful. So that was phase 1. And now we move into phase 2, which is actually where we are right now, the quantitative phase. Again, working with ITRACKS, in this case, a survey platform, as well as a tool called iMarket, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. We're moving on to quantitative. We're talking about numbers now. Going to a much larger sample, getting basic demographic information, gender, income, education, number of kids, age of kids, what they do on weekends, what they do during the week, the ability to ask some attitudinal information about both their lives and the services that they use or don't use for that matter. We were also able, or we are able, to test reaction to concept descriptions using this iMarket tool and go very detailed and very both broad and in-depth with getting people's reactions to them. At the same time, able to get an evaluation, a more formal evaluation of interest in a list of potential service offerings, which is still fairly large, but we did winnow it down a bit just from the qualitative research. Again, basic question in any market research project is who to talk to. Who are the right people, where are they, and how many of them? Same essential customers in this phase. Men and women, we found there were no real differences, but so we have both included in the sample. Same basic demographic base, families with young kids. We did much broader on income in this particular study. We anticipate being able to look at differences between cohorts, again, in terms of age, in terms of geography, in terms of individual families' situations, one versus the other. We expanded our geography, not so much an issue for an online survey, but because we had heard the qualitative, we felt very comfortable expanding from that to go to a much broader base and a much broader range in terms of location as well. In this case, we're talking big numbers, 400 to 500, depending on how well our recruiting is going, and roughly 100 to 150 in a group so that we can make some comfortable comparisons. You need about 7 to 8 percentage points if you're talking about 100, somewhere from 100 and 150 in a group. What to ask them and how to ask it. Similar to the qualitative work, we're looking for the interest in these service offerings, both in a general kind of pick your top 5, pick your top bottom 5, you know, why were these your favorites, why were these not so much your favorites. We're also able to ask them about the individual concepts of interest with some of those service offerings included to see kind of what fit well and what maybe didn't fit so well, again, based on hypotheses from the qualitative results. In addition, and these are kind of some basic questions from concept testing, to compare these concepts on the basis of how appealing customers find them, how unique, again, key for a comparison between competitors if you're trying to differentiate yourself. You know, are these even believable? You know, do people believe that this particular concept or this particular positioning fits or is possible from a certain provider or provider of a certain service? And some kind of commitment. This depends on whether you're talking about a product or a service, but you know, you can't just say how much do you like it. You have to say, well, you know, would you be willing to buy it? Would you be willing to try it? Would you be willing to tell a friend about it? You know, some level of, you know, when, you know, sort of when the rubber meets the road, as it were. And in addition to being able to quantify those things, the iMarket tool, which I'll show more about in a second, actually lets you show the respondent the actual, in this case, text or image, and lets them literally mark it up. You know, what are the things that you like about this? What are the things that you don't like about it? And rather than just asking them, they can show you by pointing to and commenting on different parts of whatever it is that you show them. And this is what the respondent, and this isn't our study, this is an example, what a respondent gets if they're doing this iMarket. And you can change all of these things. Right here it's an agree, disagree, and a change. And they actually have a highlighter and can go through and either highlight words or highlight sections, and then actually put a concept, a comment on kind of why they liked something and why they didn't like it. And what you get at the end of all this is what's called a heat map, which combines all of the individual respondents' likes and dislikes and actually shows you the things that were highlighted as likes and dislikes most often. This is not from the study that I'm working on right now, but it's very similar to what we're looking at. And I'd ask people sort of out there to just sort of take a second and look at this. This is basically things that people liked about these two tagline/concepts. And it's interesting to note that of all the things that people highlighted, in this case, 86% of the things that they highlighted were likes. So both of these things were liked fairly often and with a fairly high degree of consistency from all the respondents. And up in the left-hand corner, you can see how many people actually did put a like on something. So at the top of the list is sort of 96. If it's really red, that means that 96, in this case out of 200, really liked it. If it's blue and a cooler shade, it means it was highlighted much less often. So a couple of things that you can tell just from this heat map is the description on the top, more red, more orange, had more likes on it in general than the bottom one did. And the things that people like the most are this idea of one destination, the idea of personalized, and the idea of simple. Much less red on the bottom tagline, but they also did focus in on this notion of easily or easily connects. So the heat map gives you a nice visual, first of all, and you can look at all the individual numbers that are behind this, but it really can give you a lot of different information all at once in one kind of map. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how ours actually turn out on this. The other thing that we get, and this is more sort of basic quantitative research, not necessarily relevant to individual tools from ITRACKS, how many people did prefer one versus the other? How many people and which people liked concept 1 better versus concept 2 better? And you can also get information about this notion of appealing and believability and uniqueness and likely to purchase. And this is just a way that I like to show these, which is the very appealing, extremely appealing to the left. Usually, sometimes it's in green, so it's a like, sort of a color that's liked, and then yellow in the middle, and then red on the end. But I decided to make this more of a harmonious combination. And this gives you a really quick way to look at all 5 points on the scale at the same time. You can see concept 1 and concept 2, I think it was 45%, either extremely or very, found the concept either extremely or very appealing. But if you break out the extremely and the very separately, you can see that in fact concept 2 did much better because there was a much higher percentage of people that said they liked it, they thought it was extremely appealing, as opposed to concept 1. So that's another output that's going to come from this. We didn't go through this in detail in this particular project, but voice of the customer, another way to use voice of the customer information is if you're looking at key customer attributes, you can actually measure the importance of those attributes, again, prioritize for customers, and you can also look at how competitors or yourself actually perform on those customer attributes. So if you put it all on a scatter plot like this one and map importance versus performance, you can see that if you're up in this right-hand corner, you are both high in importance and you're also doing really well on it. So that's, you want to keep going, you want to keep doing well, but you are doing well. If you look at over in this area, you're talking about an element that's really high in importance, but you are doing not well at all in performance, and you're going to need to pay attention to that if you're going to hang on to your customers. And finally, there might be some things that you're doing really well on, but they're not really all that important, so maybe you don't need to put as much emphasis on them. And another way of looking at some of this information is if you can look at what's called revealed importance, which is using some regression analysis, actually find out what things may be driving people's satisfaction that they aren't able or willing to kind of tell you directly. And so there are other ways to draw inferences and insight out of this. So what's next? We are still in the field on this. I don't have, I can't say that it's been a total success story yet because we're not done. We'll be finished in reporting on this by the end of June. But so far, things are going really well. Clients happy. They've already been able to make some decisions. Once we have the data in-house, my client will make some decisions about service offerings and how to move forward with those new positionings. Oops, sorry about that typo. That should be positionings. And in the meantime, the whole team is on the same page because we had this voice of the customer conversation with them as an output from the first phase of the project. we were able to bring people into the fold with the fact that we had data and that there was a coherent and a consistent story behind all of this. And because the results from the two phases of the research are linked together, there's continuity as we move forward in the process. So I look forward to having that finished, and I look forward to finding out what the answer is when all is said and done. And that's it for my formal presentation. Be happy to answer questions and look forward to hearing what some of those might be. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for the amazing presentation. Thanks a lot. All right, we will now move into the question period. If you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat area at the bottom of your GoToWebinar panel. And I do have some that have come in through the webinar, so we'll start with those, and then we'll move on to the new ones. So, all right. Here's a question. It would be interesting to hear an example of how text from the transcripts was analyzed.
Sure. In this particular case, it was, in many cases, I pull out quotes that illustrate a particular thematic point. You know, if we're talking about a theme that has to do with busy families, you know, you can pull out, say, the number of times people talked about busyness. You can also pull out some key stories that seem to illustrate it really well or illustrate different pieces of the story that you're trying to tell. In this particular case, I wasn't just looking for wants and needs, but was mostly looking for things that were the most illustrative of the collective understanding in how people answered a question.
Great, thanks, Darby. All right, the next question here. How do you recruit participants, and what was the incentive?
Actually, the ITRACKS folks will be able to answer that a little bit better than I can because they actually did the recruiting. For this project, for both qualitative and quantitative, we used panel participants, and so we were not recruiting cold, but going through different partners that ITRACKS has, as well as ITRACKS' own panel, to, in this case, some specific geographies that were identified, and just asking them screening questions. The first being, you know, do you have, you know, describe your family, you know, do you have these young kids? What is your income? And so people basically know kind of how many people of certain types are in their panel, so they're able to make projections about how many people they're able to recruit. I don't know what the incentives were. They're typically going to be higher for the qualitative because it's over 3 days versus a short survey, but it's probably in the tens of dollars, and for the quantitative, it's more likely to be in the single dollars. Our particular survey in the quantitative phase is about 9 minutes or so. So that's what I can tell you about that. If you're cold calling or recruiting, it takes much longer and it's much more expensive than using a panel.
Great, and I can comment on the recruiting process as well a little bit. So for the qualitative groups, when they're conducted online or through mobile, through the mobile app, typically there's various ways of doing it, but in this type of study, typically we would use panelists, and they would be emailed to determine their availability, and we'd probably recruit a few more than are necessary for the group, just in case we have some cancellations last minute. And then the screening, there would be a survey with screening questions. And then typically ITRACKS will do a couple of reminder calls and sometimes just doing a bit of a technology check as well, making sure they've got the technology that they're going to need to participate. And especially if there are some screening questions that are very important to the study, sometimes those will be rescreened during the reminder call as well, just to make sure that we've got the right people coming to the group. And then usually there's a couple email reminders too, just to making sure that everybody is available. With a bulletin board, a great technique to ensure engagement is also some reminders. ITRACKS will monitor the board, and if there's some participants that haven't logged in, or if they maybe logged in one day but didn't log in the second day, we'll also do some email and telephone reminders just to ensure that there is engagement.
And they also don't get their incentive unless they participate to a certain degree, so that's an incentive as well.
Yes, yeah. So if there is sort of a partial participation, they would often get a partial incentive associated with it. All right. So going on to the next question. For some of us, best practices includes an iterative process where a qual phase would follow as well as precede the quant phase. Does Voice as a customer or do you have a point of view on this?
Sure. I definitely have a point of view on it. I think the more research you can do, probably the better. I think it could be very useful once a concept or something has been developed and it's been put through an evaluative phase and a quantitative phase to go back and say, okay, well, this is what you told us initially, this is what we found in doing the larger survey. You know, is this really what, does this mean what we think it means? Just to sort of double check. I think you can get stuck in that from moving forward. I also think obviously it adds expense and time depending on what it is you're trying to do. But I think it can be, I can think it can be really useful.
Great.